Welcome to Warsaw. My name is Dr. Frank Henkler-Stephani. I have been working as a scientist on nicotine and alternative products for many years. I'm here at the Global Forum on Nicotine, the best place in the world to talk about tobacco harm reduction and a very good place to meet the community and experts. I'm looking forward to interesting talks. Yes, I'm very glad to be joined by Professor Gerry Stimson. You have been working on harm reduction, I think, for 50 years now. Initially in the field of illicit drugs, you recognize that working with heroin users, the risk of spreading AIDS was much higher than the risk of the drug itself. And so you evaluated needle exchange programs and other practical measures to reduce the risk, and you became advisor to the British government. I think you even coined the British drug policy for more than 10 years. At some point, you, however, decided also to get involved in tobacco harm reduction. Can you explain why this topic became interesting to you?
Yes, it's a very kind introduction, and it reminds me that I've been working in this field for rather a long time.
Oh, sorry.
And yes, you're quite right. I first came to drugs harm reduction because I was running. I'm a social scientist working in public health, and I got involved with drugs harm reduction in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when UK and many European countries and cities were faced with this problem of HIV spreading in different sectors of the population, in marginalized populations, difficult to reach populations. So yes, I became very much involved in researching the response, which was to expand needle exchange and to introduce methadone. And also I became involved in the policy advice. And the UK was one of the first countries to have a specific government policy position that the threat of the spread of HIV was much more important than drug use per se. So yeah, I was in harm reduction for many years, and then I worked with WHO, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and World Bank, trying to sell that idea to many countries which were then experiencing problems of HIV and later HCV with drug users. So I'd done that for many years, and eventually I left academic work and got involved in advocacy work for harm reduction. But then around 2010, I guess, to jump a few decades forward, I heard about e-cigarettes. And I thought, well, this looks very interesting, because I didn't know until then what the harm reduction option was for smoking. So that's when I suddenly thought, well, all I've learned about drugs harm reduction could apply to this area. And I can expand a little bit on that, but that's how I jumped in at the deep end.
Yeah, but it's interesting because it means that before e-cigarettes, we didn't have a sensible alternative and much options to do harm reduction with tobacco, because some people try to make the cigarette safer, reduce toxicants. Sure. Yeah. But of course, these were not very sufficient measures, so the e-cigarette was a really game changer.
Yes, it really was. And if you go back, and you've mentioned the attempt to develop a safer cigarette, there was NRT, nicotine replacement therapy, and of course snus in Scandinavia. But there wasn't really an acceptable, cheap, viable alternative to smoking. I mean, some people saw that might happen one day, and there's an English psychiatrist called Michael Russell who foresaw that if you could separate the nicotine from the dirty delivery system, you'd have great individual and public health benefit. But it was really, with Honlik inventing, the patent for e-cigarettes in 2003, Ryan starting to sell them, those products coming on the market 2007, 2010 onwards, suddenly there was something that was good for people who wanted to stop smoking but didn't want to stop using nicotine.
When you did turn to tobacco harm reduction, what did you expect? Much welcoming from society, from governments, and optimistic endorsement?
Absolutely, but that didn't happen, because I thought that my view that here was a good solution, and in fact a solution that doesn't cost governments any money. That's unusual in public health, because it's the person who's switching is paying for it. It's not government paying for treatment or paying for a prevention program. And I thought that all my colleagues in public health would jump on this as well, but it was completely opposite to that. And disappointing, because many of my colleagues, public health directors and so on, were very much pro-drugs harm reduction and pro-drug policy reform. But when it came to tobacco, it was a different gaze. They had a very different idea, and they were very suspicious about this, and we can explore that. But yes, I felt very lonely for a while.
One reaction to be less lonely, perhaps, and to raise support was perhaps the founding of the Global Forum Nicotine, I think in 2014. Was it a reaction of realizing that there's not enough support, there's much controversy?
I think it was to develop a forum where lots of people could come together to discuss these ideas. And in fact, I brought some of that from my previous work on advocacy and drugs harm reduction, where we used to run a big annual conference, and we tried to make that open to everybody. So there'd be researchers, there'd be politicians, there'd be police and criminal justice people and drug users, all in the same room. And it was a marvelous interaction. So when Paddy Costall and I had this idea for the Global Forum on Nicotine, we wanted to reflect that and have a forum where everybody was welcome. Whether it's manufacturers or politicians or researchers or nicotine users. And that was and is still our vision, that this is an event open to everybody. But of course, that has its difficulties because some people don't feel comfortable.
Well, let's name it. I would start with the successes you reached to academics. And I think you even helped in several countries as Germany to establish something like counter-publicity, scientists who are critical to the restrictive approach to harm reduction, who really came out, realizing there is international support. So I think it was really helpful to link up the community internationally, but also in different countries. But you didn't reach out to WHO and to name it precisely.
Yes. I mean, as well as the Global Forum on Nicotine, we have Knowledge Action Change has some big projects which are about communicating about harm reduction. And we're a small organization, but we like to try to encourage and facilitate people to do, the important work. And even here at the conference, for example, we managed to get money to bring consumer advocacy organizations to this event. So reaching out is important, but there are some people who are very hard. Some people are very hard to reach because they don't want to listen at the moment, and that includes WHO and some other big international groups.
Yeah, it's a really problem for us as an associations. Of course, we have technical expert knowledge, and when we approach, for example, we have issues in Germany like prohibition of menthol, comprehensive flavor bans on health reasons. If we approach them, they just say, well, we will not talk to you because there's an internationally binding treaty.
Yes.
The Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and it doesn't allow us to talk to you. I think it's quite problematic. Do you think that's a correct interpretation?
I think that it's this is Article 5.3 in the FCTC. I think it is both a problematic article, and it's often over-interpreted and wrongly interpreted because it was designed to keep the industry at arm's length, but it didn't forbid contact, yes. But it said, you've got to be very careful and clear when you have contact with the industry. I think it is a flawed article because in the current context where you have a wide, where tobacco companies are changing, if they're now manufacturing e-cigarettes, you need to encourage that. And if you look at parallel fields, for example, in personal transport, motor transport, you're trying to go from carbon-based, petrol and diesel to electric. You wouldn't say to the car manufacturers, you've got to do this, but we're not going to talk to you about it. You need to engage and encourage that shift. In fact, in the UK, in encouraging energy producers to go to renewables, they actually pay them to do that.
Yes.
My electricity bill includes a tax which goes to companies to help them invest in renewables. And you can't imagine that happening with tobacco, can you? That we actually could positively encourage companies. We should be positively encouraging companies to shift from selling combustibles to selling safer nicotine products. But it's just this very peculiar area where we say, no, you can't talk to people in industry or even slightly involved or engaged with industry, even at a distance.
Formally, WHO is still committed to tobacco harm reduction. I was myself on the working group on Article 9 and 10, and there is still a commitment to reduce toxicity of tobacco products, to reduce tobacco-related diseases, but the sections are empty. They are kept empty for future consideration, but future consideration never happened.
I know.
And now the working group was resolved. But do you think there might be options that interested parties may press for a commitment really to continue the work on toxicity reduction, or is it not realistic that a realistic option that party will really put pressure on WHO?
I think it's very difficult to see how that change might occur. In theory, the biannual meeting of the FCTC is under the control of the countries. So any country can make a suggestion, or any country could veto something. They don't vote; they can vote. But really, if any country says don't like that, or that stops things happening. Unfortunately, the countries which have progressive policies on tobacco harm reduction don't really want to rock the boat. International meetings. What is in it for the UK has a positive approach to e-cigarettes, but what the UK government would say? Well, is it really worth our while making a fuss here, or making to try to change opinion here, because we have so many other issues of international relations? Why should we upset everybody here for the sake of something which not that important on our agenda? So that's the sad thing, because you've got the UK, you've got New Zealand, you've got Sweden, you've got countries that are doing harm reduction without knowing they're doing it, like Japan.
Yes.
And there's enough there to actually begin to swing things. So the potential is there, but I don't see it happening in the short run.
You are still a driving force behind knowledge exchange, and as I understand it, you are still, I think, very engaged and supporting people, and global state or harm reduction reports are still, I think, the best you can read on tobacco harm reduction. And in a recent interview, you said you are still optimistic. It sounded a little bit more cautious than perhaps in 2014.
Yes.
But are you still optimistic, and what would be your prognosis on tobacco harm reduction? You said it will happen, we do not know when.
I'm optimistic, and I think it's a matter of time perspective, and really we could be doing much more to speed up that process. But when you look at some other areas of health, it often takes a couple of decades to begin to change opinion. I remain optimistic because I think what is driving this is consumers and products. Governments can get in the way, or they can help speed things up. But if you look at the interest in safer nicotine products globally, it's on a trajectory going upwards. Even where they are technically illegal, there's a demand for them. So the smokers know that this is a viable alternative, and there are good products, and the products are improving all of the time. So it's not it's rarely it is sort of policy in the EU, in the sense that there's the regulatory framework. So I remain optimistic, but I recognise that it might be a long, slow process. And it's something that if governments got behind it, just think what we could have achieved. For example, Japan doesn't have a policy on harm reduction, but in Japan, cigarette sales have dropped by 50% since the introduction of heated tobacco products. That's never been achieved before in tobacco control. So there are some really good examples where this is clearly working, and that's why I remain optimistic.
Well, so we will share your optimism and hope for a good development. Hopefully we meet again at the next VFN, and it was a very big pleasure talking to you, and we are around maybe for further discussion. Look and listen to interesting talks, and thank you very much for the interview.
You're very kind. Thank you very much.